Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll start for those of you who may need to get away. So on behalf of the NHLI, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to this very auspicious occasion. I'd like to thank Stuart for asking me to give, I promise you, a one-minute introduction. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Rosen for his inaugural. We have been friends since, I'm afraid to say, 1985, when we were house officers together at the Charing Cross Hospital. And as you know, Stuart's gone on to great things since then. Not only does he hold down 2 cardiology consultant positions at 2 different trusts, but he's also managed to develop a lot of expertise in complex cardiology, interaction with oncology and neurology and other things. But in addition to that, he also has an extremely high profile as an excellent educator. He's dedicated time to maximizing clinical skills, something that is lost, I think, in a lot of training currently. But also an inspiration to undergraduate medical students, encourage them into cardiology or the disciplines that they would like. But if that wasn't enough, he's also managed somehow to maintain a prominent research profile, both in studies driven by himself and by selflessly contributing patients to other people's research. And I think this is probably a belated honour as Professor of Practice. This is an extremely important title within Imperial College, a relatively new title, but one certainly within NHLI that we're really delighted to have and to support. So without ado, Stuart, we look forward very much to your intriguingly entitled inaugural lecture from the Gallery of an Accidental Cardiologist.
Thank you very much indeed for your very kind words, Justin. I have to say, though, that at several points I didn't have a clue as to who you're referring to. Dear friends, a while ago, after the generous award of this title to me by the college, Edwin sent an email to suggest that it might be appropriate for me to give an inaugural lecture, continuing a fine old tradition. I thought about it for a while. What would be the purpose of such a lecture? If one had a background of stellar research achievements and hugely exciting discoveries in the pipeline that were worthy of showcasing, to add luster to the reputation and profile of NHLI, that would justify it. However, I don't. Or how about the opportunity of a near captive audience to bang on with a lot of self-aggrandizing nonsense? I've been on the receiving end of such excruciating events before, and don't think that anyone here is so bad as to deserve that fate. So why am I giving this lecture? Well, for 3 or perhaps 4 reasons. The first and greatest is that it gives me an opportunity to say thank you, not just the very fulsome thanks due to the NHLI and Imperial for honouring me with this title, and I really do feel very honoured and grateful, but to express my gratitude to many important figures who have had considerable influence in my education, training, and career, including quite a few in this room. The second aspect is that there are a number of themes or topics that have held my attention over this long period, and I would like to consider 1 or 2 of these. A central one has been the, let me loosely term it, person-brain-heart axis, with several aspects of which I've been professionally engaged, with 1 or 2 small but original contributions. In the course of looking at these issues and problems over the years, it has occurred to me that the very methodology of how we come to acquire knowledge and, albeit limited, understanding of these topics has itself evolved dramatically. So the very approach to gaining the knowledge is radically transformed. By the way, in parentheses, this is emblematic of such developments in the wider fields of medicine and science. Finally, in the course of this odyssey, 2 other strands are interwoven. The implications for conveying knowledge and understanding to our students and trainees, so they have at least the same degree of advantage that we enjoyed as they start on their grand tours, and, if they are willing, for us to offer the chance of learning from our mistakes, for they are many. Also, our abilities to communicate truth, hope, and tools for independence to our patients. Ultimately, And this remains my firm belief after 35 years as a doctor. The privilege, and it is a privilege, to serve them is the true justification for all that we do. I've entitled the lecture From the Gallery of an Accidental Cardiologist. The accidental bit will emerge in due course. From the gallery is the format that I would like to adopt. All of our lives can be thought of in terms of an art gallery. Corridor after corridor of pictures, images from different periods with varying styles. Some pictures are arresting, some are shocking, and we walk past those rather quickly. Some are beautiful and comforting, and we stand a while to reflect. Like the hopefully not too irritating guide to the collection, I will show you a selection of these pictures and give some background or context. There are no text slides, and this is not a didactic exercise. Let us commence in the oldest gallery and the earliest and most important figures, my parents. I had a very privileged upbringing, and they were the greatest privilege. I will not tell you much personal, apart from that they were really wonderful people, and both were doctors. My father, an old-style general practitioner in Hull, an excellent clinician, a very good diagnostician, very hard-working, and a remarkable combination of kind and gentle on the one hand, but very tough when facing injustice or unfairness. In his early years in the Manchester Jewish Hospital, he would work the standard 1-in-1 rota and maintain the same for several years when we were children. What's happening here? That's it. Lots of home visits, on-call at night, and home obstetrics with sometimes up to 60 home births a year. I learnt a huge amount from him about the business of being a doctor. Not least as I sat in the back of his Rover 3.5 litre and he talked to me about cases between home visits. My mother, in some respects, was even more remarkable, doing Science A-levels from scratch in the 6th form in Leeds before going to medical school. She was also inspired by her uncle, the late Dr. Samuel MD, an important communal medical figure in those days. My mother was a very promising anaesthetist until I arrived and put the kibosh on her career, at least temporarily, until she returned first to public health and then a brief spell in general practice with my father. Round about age 4 or 5, I simply knew that medicine would be my chosen path, and, sorry, this is rather creepy, I was very keen on my parents' copy of Gray's Anatomy, especially these two pictures. I remember them distinctly. Now, those days were very exciting in terms of the world importance of medical breakthroughs, and I particularly remember this one, Barnard's first transplant. I'm very grateful for my schooling. After Froebel House, a rather cute preparatory school around the corner from my father's surgery, I went to Pembroke College, where, questionably for a medical career, my greatest interests were English, history, and classics, with a bit of with a bit of chemistry. By the way, I'm only half joking about the English and history for a medical career. The English lessons included a lot of quite old-fashioned grammar, critical evaluations, and repeated exercises in doing précis, which I think are actually key to writing scientific texts. As to history, my students will know how important I regard it in giving context to scientific developments and correctly ascribing important ideas and developments in approach to former generations. But more on that later. I also acquired much enthusiasm for the consideration of philosophical problems, on which subject my father also knew a lot, having used some of his long hours during national service in the Army of Occupation in West Germany to reading in that area. The next few pictures in the gallery take us to the Holy Land. Before university, I was extremely fortunate to spend time in Jerusalem at the Kol Torah Yeshiva, or Rabbinical Academy. I learnt much there, albeit not in the conventional way. Without any doubt, everyone there knew more than I did. So the only way was upwards. But it did change my approach to study. Learning there is mostly done very actively, in pairs, in debate, with fire and force, as well as with deep respect. I also got a slight inkling into the extraordinary standards that can be obtained with real high-level motivation. As well as this, I had the inspiration to see, albeit briefly, the head, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a saintly genius, among whose interests were important questions of medical ethics. Oh, and I read a lot, including the historical sweep of the rabbinical literature. It was then that I learnt about this great man, Rabbi Moses Maimonides. Osler described Maimonides as the prince of physicians, an exemplar of the fact that medicine, ethics, and the spiritual can keep good company together. At that time, I also had prolonged discussions with the polymath, Rabbi Solomon Sassoon, about the mind-body identity problem. You can see that this was a focus on the top end of the person-brain-heart axis, noted above. Let's move on in the gallery. In Cambridge, at Pembroke College, I read the Medical Sciences Tripos. After the impressive opening lecture from the Regius Professor of Physics, Sir John Butterfield, who told us always to make physical contact with our patients, e.g. taking their pulse, I discovered it was a deliberately quite old-fashioned and theoretical course with no live subjects in 3 years. Sorry, that's a little unkind in respect of some of the teaching staff. Anyway, because I took the 3-year route to second MB, it allowed me to read quite a lot, especially pathology. Our students and trainees, in particular, will observe this is my second reference to reading a lot. So, contrary to the prevailing local attitude of, what is a textbook? I would say, become friends of the library, and you won't regret it. The 3-year route had another advantage. I got the opportunity in the final year to do a major module on clinical physiology. The combined circulatory, respiratory, and renal physiology applied clinically and in some depth, extended, for example, as far as learning about complications of atrial and ventricular septal defects. The star lecturers were Dr. Michael Petch, consultant cardiologist, and Sir Terence English, the noted cardiac surgeon. So this was, in a way, the perfect grounding for my ultimate specialization, except that at the time, those were not my special interests. The lectures that took my breath away were those of Professor Charlie Loke of King's College, Cambridge. His central interest was the placenta, and he tackled one amazing question. Why is the fetus not immunologically rejected by its mother? As an aside, I quite recently gathered that if I'd looked hard enough in the library at the Kol Torah Yeshiva, in the introduction to the book Balei HaNefesh by Rabbi Abraham ben David, the Ravad of Poskier in the 12th century, I would have found that very question asked, but I didn't, and I digress. In the context of my passion for immunology, Charlie Loke's lectures were awe-inspiring. Every possible hypothesis was considered. Non-immunogenicity of the fetus, general immune tolerance of the mother, specific tolerance to her mate, etc. Then the amazing punchline, his suggestion that the antigens on the outside of the trophoblast tissue are protected by some masking molecules, and, wait for it, when those are discovered, you will understand why cancers are not immunologically rejected. Well, this blew me away. I knew exactly where I wanted to go in my medical career, to the immunology of cancers. And this was 1982, by the way. Incidentally, since I raised this topic, the present-day thinking on this central question regarding the placenta has not moved that far conceptually, pardon the pun. Thus, the onset of pregnancy seems to cause the genes responsible for recruiting immune cells to sites of inflammation to be turned off within the decidua. As a result of these changes, T cells are unable to accumulate inside the decidua and do not attack the fetus and the placenta. specifically, at least in animal models, the implantation of an embryo changes the packaging of certain chemokine genes in the nuclei of the developing deciduous stromal cells. The change in the DNA packaging permanently deactivates or silences the chemokine genes, especially toll-like receptors, TLR6. Consequently, the chemokines are not expressed, the T cells are not recruited to the site of the embryo implantation. Interestingly, this is a true epigenetic modification wherein gene expression is changed without the presence of a heritable gene mutation. Well, from the ivory towers of Cambridge to the less than ivory tower blocks of West London, and specifically Charing Cross Hospital. The clinical course was, I am sorry to say, not amazing, but there were a few outstanding figures from whom I learnt a lot. Here are two. My introduction to clinical medicine was Professor Abe Gus, a medical genius, clinician, scientist, and teacher extraordinaire. "You are not aggressive enough," was his opening shot at the student firm as he presented medical topics and argued and debated in a manner curiously reminiscent of the Lithuanian yeshivas. I also then first met Professor Tiny Meny, who unfortunately was not able to be with us today. Elegant, suave, wonderful with patients. I would watch for hours in the clinics as he established the most extraordinary doctor-patient rapport with those fortunate enough to be cared for by him. His special subject was the immunology of rheumatic diseases. Thus, I saw a clear route forward to work with him and his team and then move towards radiotherapy and oncology. But it did not quite work out like that. I did an elective at Shaare Zedek Hospital in Jerusalem with two other very notable physicians, Professor Rabbi Abraham on your left and Professor Monty Tzion on the right. Professor Abraham showed once again, if any further evidence was required, the harmony of medical practice and the study of the Talmudic literature, of which he had a complete set in his office. Interestingly, he also had two particular cardiological interests. Firstly, that of right ventricular infarction, and secondly, the role of magnesium. When I veered towards cardiology a few years later, I found that these two issues were very topical, but they also exemplified a more general tendency for such questions to recur on an approximately 30-year cycle. Long enough, I guess, for each generation to forget the wisdom of its predecessors. Professor Tzion in particular helped me a lot. An old-style South African cardiologist, he thought it reasonable, personally, to teach me the evaluation of a split-second heart sound and the variability of murmurs through maneuvers such as squatting. Another significant interaction whilst I was there was that I raised the issue of immunology and cancers with a couple of oncologists, and they rather poured cold water on the idea. For the benefit of our students and trainees, I would point out that this is not an isolated example of ultimately poor professional advice that I've received over the years, so do retain your critical faculties, especially in relation to advice from us oldies. I will fast forward a little because I really want to look at ideas rather than talk about me. Suffice it to say that for some quite petty junior doctor reasons, my time as a house officer with Professor Meny's team did not quite enthrall me, as unfortunately I saw very little of the great man. However, I was soon and quite unexpectedly very enthusiastic for the other half of the job, cardiology. In a very recent and extremely generous email to me, Professor Richard Sutton, who also unfortunately could not join us this evening, urged me, quote, "Do not hold back on issues which have inspired and deterred you in the past. Your introduction to cardiology was not exactly conventional," unquote. So here goes. At the center of cardiology at Charing Cross Hospital was the charismatic but highly controversial figure of Peter Nixon. A medic with the airborne forces and very early exponent of invasive cardiological assessment, he even invented the Nixon transeptal needle to measure left atrial pressures directly, and was at the forefront of cardiac surgery in the late 1950s and early 60s. By the time I joined him, he had moved a long way from the biomedical approach, adopting George Engel's biopsychosocial model of health and healthcare with a vengeance. He utilized a fascinating model to account for much of and suggest treatment for acquired cardiac disease. The basis was the Yerkes-Dodson law, an inverted U-curve which describes an empirical relationship between arousal and performance. This was originally developed by the psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson in 1908, but Nixon often referred to a 1945 paper by Swank and Marchand, who had applied this model to battle fatigue in World War II, describing the performance of soldiers on first joining active fighting units. There was a phase in which the build-up of activity and pressure led to a sharpening of performance, but this could not be maintained indefinitely. After a while, excessive struggle, pressure, effort led to a decline in performance, and soldiers became first hyper-reactive and then exhausted and ill. Nixon's contribution was to seek to extend this pretty much to all of human activity. He adapted the earlier curves to generate the human function curve, the upslope of which was characterized by healthy, sustainable levels of activity, but once one was pushed too far and yet continued to struggle, there would be a failure of homeostasis and a plethora of symptoms would supervene, largely mediated by exhaustion and hyperventilation. This was the so-called effort syndrome described by Sir Thomas Lewis 50 years earlier, but as Abe Guz pointed out to me, without there ever having been a precise definition. I should add that Nixon saw it as natural that the performance arousal curve should completely resemble the well-known Frank-Starling relationship between cardiac output and end diastolic pressure or end diastolic volume, with its healthy contractile function on the upslope and sharp reduction in performance in circumstances of pathologically increased pressure or volume loading in the failing heart. There. In any event, Nixon's model incorporated the idea that timely intervention with a sleeping and resting regimen and retraining of the breathing could rescue an individual and bring them back to health and success. Obviously, this is extremely appealing. The focus was on enablement and training of the patient rather than treatment. We worked with complementary therapists in addition to the medical team. The morale of the team was sky high, and very satisfyingly, it worked if you picked the right patients. Very combative by nature, Nixon rejected a lot of contemporary cardiological perspectives, and in his post-invasive cardiology days, he tended not to publish in mainstream journals. For years, I've asked myself, what were the good bits, the parts that help people, and wherein lay the faults? I believe that a key problem was philosophical, epistemological. It was a highly inductive, in fact, intuitive approach, not really testable in a Popperian sense. And patient assessments were very subjective. So you could quite easily find just the symptoms you were looking for. I think the elements useful to cardiology might have been retrievable. In fact, in the intervening years, one has seen the establishment of many psychological factors as of key importance in the etiology and development of acquired cardiac disease. However, I believe this could not have been carried further through that unit with its methodology, not least because of the discredit that followed on from an ill-fated excursion fueled by encouragement of the press to apply the approach to patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. However, that's a major story in its own right, but not for now. After 4 years in that line of work, I left Charing Cross Hospital to become a tutor in cardiology at the Hammersmith Hospital, under the direction of the late and great Celia Oakley, an extremely capable and actually pretty tough cardiologist. I found her extremely generous and supportive, as well as the tremendous advantage of a teaching salary for quite modest hours, it allowed me to join the cardiology research team with Paolo Camici in the MRC cyclotron unit, now expunged from the Hammersmith site, under the overall wonderful leadership of Terry Jones, who I'm delighted to see here this evening. At that time, we had the tremendous good fortune of having a critical combination of interdisciplinary skills, a leading-edge technology in positron emission tomography, enough money, and great leadership. We explored some key questions. What mediated the remodeling of the left ventricle after a myocardial infarction? Besides the better-known application of PET, the quantitative non-invasive measurement of blood flow, we exploited several methodologies to examine the role of the sympathetic nervous system. No less a figure than Eugene Brown-Wald himself said it would be, quote, dynamite, unquote, if we could demonstrate beta receptor downregulation as one of the indicators of overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system in remodeling left ventricular myocardium remote from areas of infarction. But we did just that. And Nikos Spirou, who's also here this evening, his doctoral thesis attests to it. I believe that this is the most direct evidence, by the way, for the molecular mechanism of the action of beta blockers in reducing morbidity and mortality in chronic heart failure. Like several galleries, this one also contains some fakes, and the very observant in the audience will note that this is actually a picture of 11-carbon hydroxyephedrine uptake rather than beta receptors with 11-CCGP, but the brush strokes are the same. At the same time, there was continuing interest in what I believe to be really quite an infrequent disorder, but an interesting clinical conundrum nevertheless, that of cardiac syndrome X. This exceptionally unhelpful term was coined in 1973 by Harvey Kemp, writing an editorial about Arbogast and Borassa's paper, which in turn described patients with anginal pain, ischemic-like exercise ECGs, but normal coronary angiograms. Again, it would take a few lectures to do justice to that topic. However, two important aspects caught my attention. Firstly, there was undoubtedly abnormal heightened pain perception in this group of patients, and that was demonstrable by several means. Secondly, the state of the organ to which the symptoms might be attributed, i.e. the heart, had next to nothing to do with what the patients felt. Now, the implications of this are considerable because generally patients consult doctors because of symptoms, but doctors usually offer treatments and give a prognosis based on the objective state of the bodily organs. It is very easy to see how doctors and patients could easily have conversations in which the two lines completely miss each other. Anyway, with Terry's unwavering support and with tremendous help from the neurology group under Richard Frakowiak and Chris Frith, we extended our studies to scan the brains of patients with textbook coronary artery disease and angina and defined the pathways mediating the perception of cardiac pain. It was then a relatively easy conceptual step to look at and potentially offer a solution to the enigma of silent myocardial ischemia, a situation in which the heart is starved of blood, but the patient feels no pain. Silent ischemia can be traced back to the first number of the New England Journal of Medicine in 1812, and it is dangerous, representing the loss of an important early warning system. From these figures, you will see that there are differences in the brain activation of patients with conventional angina from those with silent myocardial ischemia. But it certainly is not the case that such signals from the heart fail to reach the brain. We can see thalamic signals here in the silent ischemia patients. We believe that what probably happens is that these signals are gated or edited out at a level below that of conscious perception at the thalamus. We then looked at the opposite end of the spectrum, to the syndrome X patients, and demonstrated unique right insula activation, which I believe contributes to the sensation of chest pain in these patients. And it is a unique signal or signature for that patient group. So far, so interesting. But we wanted to go further. This picture in the gallery does not exist. It should be the pattern of washout of 11-carbon diprenorphine, a mu opiate ligand that we used to try to show that the three conditions were caused by different rates of central opiate turnover in the brain areas in question. However, after 2 years of utterly fruitless endeavor, we were taught an important but tough lesson. We'd overreached our technique and could not separate signal from noise. So this remains an unresolved area of research, and I would be keen to pursue this with interested colleagues and appropriate technology. I say appropriate technology because it was around that time that functional MRI was starting to take off, and the neurologists moved to Queen Square, to the beautiful new Wellcome unit, to continue their studies with a new technique. We had a go at that as well, with a bold, in both senses, study to image the baroreflex. But again, we were overambitious. It actually took 20 years before Gerlach and colleagues in Cologne and Hanover finally succeeded in that endeavor. Now, I'm mentioning the unsuccessful research projects not out of particular masochism, but because it is actually critically important for anyone considering going into research or just beginning to know that this is the real-life world of the researcher. Famously, Sir John Eccles, the neuroscientist who worked with Karl Popper, described how he could rejoice in a disproved idea because ultimately it got him closer to the truth. Well, that's very high-minded, but in my experience, it doesn't quite feel like that. However, in research, as well as the rest of life, as Mr. Mikorba might have said, something usually turns up. We continued with the brain-heart work to look at other cardiovascular symptoms, in particular cerebral blood flow changes in mediating the breathlessness of heart failure. Interestingly, the discovery this time was a reduction in global cerebral blood flow, and within that, further differences in the right medial postcentral and left superior frontal gyri in particular. A further study to look at the failure of the early warning system of the symptom of breathlessness in a subset of patients with brittle asthma, given methacholine challenge, also failed to bear fruit. Again, it would be worth revisiting. It should be noted, from the philosophical point of view, that in contrast with the Charing Cross years, all the studies we published in the subsequent time at the Hammersmith were very carefully characterized groups, typically of quite small numbers, using highly complex technology, but with extremely specific and testable a priori hypotheses. In those days, the fishing expedition was very much frowned upon. In parallel with the PET work, we always tried to include one or two independent methodologies. Not so doing would have been rather like looking at a scene in nature with only one eye open, i.e. little or no perspective. I had a long-standing interest in the covariance of basic biological rhythms, and this led me to explore heart rate variability in the assessment of autonomic function. Heart rate variability proved a much less expensive and more adaptable technique, albeit after a few years we found its clinical value limited other than with new, non-linear methods of analysis. However, the privatization of the cyclotron unit and my own move to a new position on the staff at Ealing and the Brompton meant less time for research, but more for the development of clinical services, especially in heart failure, for autonomic assessment and for teaching and training. In respect of the latter, small group teaching has always been my great preference, and I believe one of the most effective media. At the Brompton in the early years, I enjoyed an especially happy association with the late Philip Poole Wilson, who was a great support and an intellectual dynamo, full of the new and interesting ideas which we discussed at our periodic lunches together. His early and sudden passing were a great blow to this institution and British and European cardiology. Among many fascinating issues that we considered were the relationships between psychiatric medications and the heart. I'll come to this shortly, and the establishment of a cardio-oncology unit. With regard to the latter, about 15 years ago, a few of us first met regularly to discuss an issue that had attracted my attention years before. Why do some patients receiving chemotherapy drugs develop impaired cardiac systolic function? And could this unique situation serve as a model for the broader category of dilated cardiomyopathy? This is the rare situation in which we can look at the heart before the cardiomyopathy develops. Anyway, the rest is history. Along with Teresa McDonough and Rakesh Sharma, Alex Lyon and I were pleased to set up the UK's first bespoke cardio-oncology service in 2011, since which time we've seen going on for 1,000 patients with a range of cardiac problems ranging from risk assessment of patients with pre-existing cardiac problems about to undergo cancer treatment to those who develop cardiomyopathy from anthracyclines and or Herceptin. In more recent times, and for me this harks right back to 1982, the emerging challenge is that of the undesired involvement of the heart in cancer treatment with immunotherapeutic agents. I am sure that this will be a key research and clinical focus for our group in the coming years. At Ealing, from the start, I continued my friendship and professional partnership with Jaspal Kuna, and a connection that extended back to my earliest times at the Hammersmith. After a few years, we were joined by Amajit Sethi, who I'm delighted to see with us this evening, and have grown the department steadily since then on the pillars of clinical care, teaching, and research. We've also developed a close relationship with the mental health team at St Bernard's, now West London Mental Health NHS Trust, to explore a further aspect of brain-heart relations, in particular why cardiovascular disease is increased in people with mental health orders in general and schizophrenia in particular. The mechanisms are multifactorial, but include the fact that mental illnesses can cause adverse effects via cardiac autonomic dysfunction and a higher prevalence of metabolic syndrome, both contributing to reduced life expectancy, as well as the proarrhythmic and other effects of the antipsychotic medications. Mention must be made of the magnificent Lollipop program established by Professor Kuhn and Professor John Chambers. Lollipop has proved a remarkable accomplishment, gathering data on tens of thousands of local people in West London to elucidate the causes of the excess mortality from cardiovascular disease in Indian Asian subjects versus European Caucasians. In the course of this huge program, new genes have been identified and whole new methodologies adopted. I know little of molecular genetics, in which aspect the Lollipop program has probably scored some of its greatest successes. However, as well as this, it has for me brought with it a big philosophical shift. Some time ago, I heard an impressive presentation by John Chambers, in the course of which an interesting little phrase had crept in. The methodology was, quote, uninhibited by prior hypothesis, unquote. One moment, I said, have you just snuck in a legitimization of the fishing expedition? Yes, he said. The fishing expedition was not only tolerated, it was vaunted, it was celebrated. So what has changed? You like the hull trawlers. My suspicion is that it is the trawler, the nets, and the GPS. This brings us very much up to date to the present of big data and artificial intelligence. I am looking forward to this paradigm shift in data analysis and approach to the generation of new medical truths. We face a future of acquiring massive data sets, programming all of this into incredibly powerful computers, and seeing what the latter can come up with in terms of hitherto unconsidered relationships and associations between variables. We are hopeful that this will offer an entirely different route for a more meaningful evaluation of the physiological parameters, new and old, and their connection with incident disease and its maintenance and propagation. The approach will be no less important in the evaluation of strategies for prevention and treatment. However, someone will still have to make a judgment on the quality of the fish and the recipe to be applied. So an old-fashioned cardiologist steeped in medicine and integrative physiology might still be redeemed for further progress in the 21st century. I started with thanks and now would like to finish with thanks. In no particular order, Professor Edwin Chilvers for inviting me to give this lecture, Justin Mason for his kind words of introduction, Helen Johnson and Gareth Hyde of NHLI for their administrative help, Jackie Tweedy on the catering side. A special thank you to Joel for setting up the Eventbrite system for today and all of his help with my lectures and presentations. To our home team, Josh, Adina, Nathan, who put up with me and helped me so much. And last and dearest, Anne, who puts up with so much more and has done so throughout the long years, tolerating more repeats than an ITV viewer, and who has put together the wonderful reception that awaits us. Thank you, one and all.